The emergency lights flickered red against the broken walls of the medical bay. Commander Vala Thren felt cold metal beneath her back as consciousness slowly returned to her damaged body. Her blue-scaled skin had turned pale, almost gray from the radiation that had swept through her ship 3 days ago. The Cathari research vessel Silent Current had been her home for 2 years, but now it felt like a tomb floating through the endless darkness of space. Vala tried to move, but pain shot through her chest like lightning. The harvester weapons had done more than just damage her ship. They had poisoned the very air her crew breathed. She could hear the soft beeping of life support systems working harder than they should, struggling to keep 4 survivors alive in a vessel designed for 30 crew members. Through the broken window of the medical bay, she could see stars that seemed too bright, too close. The ship was tumbling slowly, its navigation systems destroyed in the attack. Somewhere out there, the Harvester fleet continued its march across the galaxy, consuming entire star systems like a cosmic plague. Her people had thought they were safe exploring the ancient ruins near the Voidlands. They had been terribly wrong. The door to the medical bay slid open with a grinding sound. Torin, her chief engineer, limped inside carrying a portable scanner. His usual confident smile was gone, replaced by the hollow look of someone who had seen too much death in too short a time. Behind him came Yuki, the ship's medic, her hands shaking as she checked the remaining medical supplies. The youngest member of their group, Navigator Finn, sat in the corner staring at a broken communication device. "How long do we have?" Vala asked, though she already knew the answer would not be good. Torin looked at his scanner and shook his head. 6 hours, maybe 7 if we reduce activity to minimum. The hull breach in Section 4 is getting worse. The emergency seals won't hold much longer. Yuki moved to check Vala's wounds, her touch gentle despite her own injuries. The radiation exposure was severe. Without proper treatment facilities, we're all going to get sicker before... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Finn looked up from his broken equipment. "I've been trying to boost the distress signal, but our power cells are almost empty. Even if someone hears us, the High Command declared this sector off-limits after the Harvester attack. No one is coming." The silence that followed was heavier than the artificial gravity that barely worked. Vala had served in the Cathari fleet for 15 years. She had explored distant worlds and made first contact with 3 different species. She had survived solar storms and asteroid fields and the collapse of a space station, but she had never faced the simple, terrible certainty that she was going to die alone in the dark. Through the ship's damaged communications array, they could still hear fragments of news from Cathari space. The Harvesters had destroyed 2 more colony worlds since the attack on their ship. Billions of people had been consumed by the biomechanical monsters that turned living worlds into fuel for their endless hunger. The Cathari fleet was in full retreat, abandoning entire sectors to save their core worlds. "At least we tried," Torin said quietly, settling down beside a damaged wall panel. "The data we collected about the ruins might help someone understand what the Harvesters really are." Vala nodded, though the movement made her dizzy. Their mission had discovered something important in those ancient ruins. The structures were older than any known civilization, but they contained warnings about the Harvesters, warnings that had come too late to save her crew. Yuki began recording a message on her personal device. "For my family on New Cathar," she said softly. "I want them to know we didn't suffer. I want them to know we were brave." One by one, they each recorded their final messages. Torin spoke to his wife and young children about how proud he was of them. Finn, barely old enough to serve on a deep space mission, told his parents that he loved them and that exploring the stars had been worth the risk. Vala recorded a message for her sister, asking her to take care of their elderly parents. The ship shuddered as another piece of damaged hull broke away into space. The artificial gravity flickered, making them all feel momentarily weightless before it stabilized again. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance, uncaring about the small drama of 4 dying aliens in a broken ship. "Do you think anyone will remember us?" Finn asked. Vala looked at the young navigator and tried to smile. "Someone will remember. The universe is too big and too connected for us to just disappear without meaning something." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. Space was vast beyond imagination, and they were just 4 small lives in an infinite darkness. Their ship's distress beacon would eventually stop broadcasting when the power failed completely. Their bodies would drift forever in the cold between stars, and eventually even their bones would turn to dust. The environmental systems made a grinding noise that hadn't been there an hour ago. Torin closed his eyes and leaned back against the wall. "I always thought I'd die on solid ground," he said. "Maybe in my garden, surrounded by growing things." "I thought I'd die old," Yuki added. "With grandchildren around my bed, telling stories about my adventures." "I thought I'd die saving someone," Finn said quietly. "Like in the old stories." Vala listened to her crew, her friends, and felt a deep sadness that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. They were good people who had dedicated their lives to knowledge and exploration. They had risked everything to understand the universe better, and now they would die, without anyone knowing what they had discovered. The lights flickered again, staying dark a little longer this time before coming back on. In the distance, she could hear the ship's computer making the soft chimes that meant another system had failed. Soon, the silence would be complete. Soon, the darkness would win. But for now, they were still alive. For now, they still had each other. And somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, their distress signal continued to broadcast, carrying their last hope into the void like a message in a bottle thrown into an endless ocean. The cargo hold of the human freighter Iron Dawn smelled like machine oil and recycled air. Captain Roy Mitchell wiped grease from his hands as he walked between stacks of mining equipment bound for the outer colonies. His ship wasn't pretty, but it was reliable, and after 20 years of hauling freight across human space, that was all that mattered to him. The communications officer, a young woman named Beth, called out from the bridge. "Captain, we're picking up a distress signal. It's weak, but it's definitely there." Roy climbed the narrow stairs to the bridge, his boots making hollow sounds on the metal steps. The Iron Dawn was a working ship, built for function rather than comfort. Everything was painted the same dull gray, and the only decoration was a faded photo of Earth hanging next to the main view screen. "Let me hear it," Roy said, settling into his captain's chair. The signal was barely audible through the static, but they could make out words in what sounded like the Kethari language. Beth ran it through the computer's translation system. "It's a research ship called the Silent Current. They're reporting catastrophic damage and requesting immediate assistance." Roy's first officer, a tall man named Dave, shook his head. "Captain, that signal is coming from the Voidland sector. That's Harvester territory now. Every military in the galaxy has declared it a no-go zone." "How far are we from their position?" Roy asked. Beth checked her instruments. "About 6 hours at maximum burn. But Captain, Dave's right. The Cathari High Command sent out warnings to all shipping. Anyone caught in that sector is considered lost." Roy stared at the view screen, watching the stars slide past as his ship continued toward the mining colony. He had served in the Earth Defense Force before becoming a freight captain. He had seen enough war to know when a situation was hopeless, but he had also learned that sometimes people survived impossible situations if someone was willing to take a risk. Dr. Amy Peterson emerged from the ship's small medical bay, carrying a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She was the only passenger on this run heading to the colony to set up a new hospital. "Did I hear something about a distress signal?" "Cathari research ship," Dave explained. "They're stranded in Harvester space. It's a death trap." Amy sat down at an empty console and listened to the translated message. Her face grew serious as she heard the desperation in the alien voices. They're talking about radiation poisoning and hull breaches. Without help, they'll be dead in hours. And if we go after them, we'll probably join them, Dave said. The harvesters don't leave witnesses. Roy had made hard decisions before. During the war with the Crab Nebula pirates, he had been forced to abandon damaged ships to save the rest of his convoy. He had carried the guilt of those choices for years, but he had told himself they were necessary sacrifices. This felt different. These weren't soldiers who had accepted the risks of combat. They were scientists who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. If the roles were reversed, if human civilians were dying in space, he would want someone to at least try to help them. How long would it take the Cathari military to mount a rescue? He asked. Beth checked the galactic news feeds. According to these reports, they've pulled all their ships back to defend their core worlds. They're not sending anyone into Harvester territory. So we're their only chance, Amy said quietly. Roy looked around his small bridge at the faces of his crew. Beth was young and eager, fresh out of the Merchant Academy. Dave was older and more cautious, a veteran of cargo runs who had learned to avoid unnecessary risks. Tom Bradley, his chief engineer, had joined them from the engine room and was listening to the conversation with a thoughtful expression. I won't order anyone to do this, Roy said. This isn't a military mission. We're civilians, and we all have families back home. If we vote to go, we're all taking the same risk together. Dave spoke first. Captain, I've got a wife and 2 kids on Mars. I can't ask them to become widows and orphans for aliens we've never met. Beth looked uncomfortable. I want to help, but Dave's right. The odds are terrible. Tom wiped his hands on a dirty rag and shrugged. My engines can handle the extra burn. If we're fast enough, maybe we can get in and out before the harvesters notice us. Amy set down her cold coffee and looked directly at Roy. I took an oath to save lives. I can't just ignore people who are dying when I might be able to help them. The bridge fell silent except for the soft humming of the ship's systems. Roy had spent his life hauling cargo from one world to another, making a living in the spaces between more important places. He had never considered himself a hero, just a working man trying to get by in a dangerous galaxy. But sometimes ordinary people had to make extraordinary choices. Tom, how much extra fuel will we need for maximum burn to the distress signal and back? Roy asked. We'll be running on fumes by the time we reach the colony, but we can make it, Tom replied. Roy nodded slowly. Beth, plot a course for the Cathari ship. Dave, start charging our emergency shields. Amy, get your medical bay ready for possible casualties. Dave looked shocked. Captain, are you sure about this? No, Roy admitted, but I'm sure about what happens if we don't try. Those people die, and we spend the rest of our lives wondering if we could have saved them. The Iron Dawn changed course, its engines burning brighter as it accelerated toward the dangerous sector. On the view screen, the stars began to look different, more distant and cold. They were heading into a part of space where entire fleets had been destroyed, where the harvesters consumed everything they encountered, but they were also heading toward 4 people who would die without help. And for Roy Mitchell, that made all the difference. As they traveled deeper into Harvester territory, the crew worked in focused silence. Beth monitored long-range sensors for any sign of enemy ships. Tom pushed the engines harder than they were, designed to go. Amy prepared medical equipment for injuries she couldn't imagine, and Roy sat in his captain's chair, watching the stars and hoping he hadn't just sentenced his crew to death for a rescue that might already be too late. Vala woke up breathing clean air for the first time in days. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, painted white instead of the blue-gray of Cathari ships. Strange symbols were written on the walls in a language she didn't recognize, and the gravity felt slightly heavier than what her body was used to. But she was alive, and that was more than she had expected when she lost consciousness aboard her dying ship. A human woman with kind eyes and gray hair approached her bed. The woman spoke in accented but understandable Cathari. "Hello, Commander Thren. I'm Dr. Amy Peterson. You're aboard the human vessel Iron Dawn. You've been unconscious for 8 hours." Vala tried to sit up, but her body protested with sharp pains. "My crew, Torin, Yuki, Finn, all alive and recovering," Amy assured her. "The radiation exposure was severe, but we got to you in time. Your friends are in the beds next to you." Vala turned her head and saw her 3 surviving crew members, sleeping peacefully in human medical beds. Their skin had regained some of its natural blue color, and their breathing was steady. "How?" "The Cathari military said the sector was too dangerous for rescue operations." Amy smiled sadly. "The Cathari military isn't here. We're just a cargo ship that happened to pick up your distress signal." "Just a cargo ship?" Vala struggled to understand. "You risked your lives to save strangers? Why?" Before Amy could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the human ship. Red lights flashed, and Vala could hear heavy footsteps running in the corridors outside the medical bay. Amy quickly checked her patient's vital signs and then moved to a wall communication device. "Bridge, this is medical. What's our status?" The reply came through crackling speakers. "Doc, we've got company. Harvester scout ship coming in fast. Better strap everyone down." Vala felt ice form in her stomach. The harvesters had found them, the biomechanical monsters that had destroyed her ship and killed her friends were here to finish what they had started. "You have to run," she told Amy urgently. "Leave us here and escape. The harvesters will destroy your ship just for being in this sector." Amy was already moving, securing Vala's bed and checking the restraints on the other Cathari survivors. "We don't abandon people. That's not who we are." The ship shuddered as weapons fire struck the hull. Through the small window in the medical bay, Vala could see the Harvester scout ship. It was 3 times the size of the human freighter, covered in organic-looking armor that seemed to pulse with its own life. Biomechanical tentacles writhed around weapon ports that glowed with deadly energy. Tom Bradley, the human engineer, burst into the medical bay. His uniform was covered in grease and his hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. "Commander Thren, we need your help. Captain Mitchell says you're some kind of expert on harvester technology." Vala looked at him in amazement. "You want my help to fight them? Your ship isn't designed for combat. You should be running." "Can't outrun them," Tom said simply. "They're faster than us, so we fight." Another impact shook the ship, harder this time. Vala could hear the sound of metal being torn apart somewhere in the hull. The harvester weapons were designed to breach ship armor and consume the crew inside. In minutes, the Iron Dawn would be just another dead hulk floating in space. But Vala remembered something from her research in the ancient ruins. The warnings left by the long-dead civilization had contained more than just descriptions of harvester attacks. They had included technical data about harvester weaknesses, information that her people had been trying to analyze when the attack came. "Help me up," she told Amy. "I can't save your ship from here." Amy and Tom supported her as she struggled to her feet. Her legs felt weak and her vision was blurry, but she forced herself to concentrate. "The harvesters have a weakness. Their biomechanical systems operate on a specific frequency range. If you can disrupt that frequency, their weapons and engines will shut down." Tom's eyes lit up with understanding. "Like jamming their communications?" "More than that. It would be like stopping their heart." They made their way through corridors, filled with running crew members. The human ship was smaller than any military vessel Vala had ever seen, but the crew moved with purpose and determination. No one was panicking, even though they were facing almost certain death. The engineering section was a maze of pipes and machinery that reminded Vala of her own ship. Tom led her to a large console covered with controls and readouts. This is our main power distribution system. If we can modify it to generate the frequency you're talking about, we might be able to turn it into a weapon. Working together, they began rewiring the ship's systems. Vala's knowledge of harvester technology combined with Tom's understanding of human engineering created something that neither species could have built alone. The ship shook constantly as the harvester scout continued its attack, but they kept working. "Frequency modulator online," Tom announced. "But we'll only get one shot at this. The power drain will overload our entire electrical system." Vala nodded, her hands moving across unfamiliar human controls. "Then we make it count." On the bridge, Captain Roy Mitchell watched his ship's shields failing under the harvester assault. His crew had fought bravely, but they were outgunned and outmatched. The cargo freighter's defensive systems were never meant to face military-grade weapons. "Engineering to bridge!" Tom's voice crackled over the communication system. "Frequency weapon ready! We need to get as close as possible to the target." Roy gripped his captain's chair as another blast nearly knocked him off his feet. "Close!" "Tom, that thing is trying to tear us apart." "Trust us, Captain. This will work." Roy looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. Beth was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but still working her controls. Dave had tears in his eyes, but hadn't left his post. They were ordinary people facing an extraordinary situation, and they were not backing down. "All power to engines," Roy ordered. "Take us straight at them." The Iron Dawn accelerated directly toward the Harvester scout ship, its damaged hull groaning under the stress. The alien vessel seemed surprised by the suicidal attack and increased its weapons fire, trying to destroy the human ship before it could ram them. At the last possible moment, Vala activated the frequency weapon. A pulse of invisible energy struck the Harvester ship, and suddenly its biomechanical systems began shutting down. The organic armor stopped pulsing, the weapon ports went dark, and the tentacles became still. The enemy ship drifted powerless, as the Iron Dawn limped away on failing engines. They had won, but barely. The human freighter was heavily damaged and running on emergency power. Without immediate repairs, they would not survive another attack. But they were alive. The impossible. Rescue had succeeded, and 4 people who should have died in the darkness between stars were breathing and safe. Vala looked at the humans who had risked everything to save her, and she began to understand something about their species that would change the galaxy forever. These were not warriors or heroes from ancient legends. They were ordinary people, who had made an extraordinary choice. When faced with the suffering of strangers, they had chosen compassion over caution. When confronted with impossible odds, they had chosen courage over surrender. And somehow, that had been enough. The communication chamber of the Cathari High Council was buzzing with activity that had not been seen in months. Representatives from a dozen different worlds filled the circular room, their blue-scaled faces showing a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. At the center of it all stood Commander Vala Thren, no longer the dying victim she had been just weeks ago, but a living witness to something that had shocked the entire galactic community. Council leader Aaron folded his hands and looked directly at Vala. "Let us hear it again, Commander. Tell us exactly what happened in the Voidland sector." Vala had told this story many times already, but each telling seemed to carry more weight than the last. "My research vessel was attacked by harvesters while investigating the ancient ruins. Most of my crew was killed, and our ship was left drifting, with critical damage. We had maybe 6 hours of life support remaining." The room was completely silent. Every representative knew that being stranded in harvester territory was a death sentence. The biomechanical aliens consumed everything they encountered, leaving nothing but empty space behind. The human cargo ship Iron Dawn detected our distress. "Signal, and diverted from their planned route to reach us," Vala continued. "They extracted all 4 survivors from our failing vessel and treated our radiation injuries. When a harvester scout attacked them, they fought back using a weapon we developed together from my research data." Representative Colin from the outer colonies leaned forward. A human civilian vessel engaged harvesters in combat and won? Not. Just one, Vala emphasized. They saved us twice, first from certain death by exposure, then from the harvesters themselves. And they did it without hesitation, without asking for payment or promises of future cooperation. They simply saw people in need and acted. The council chamber erupted in quiet conversations as the representatives discussed what they had heard. Council leader Aaron raised his hand for silence. Commander, you understand that this account challenges our fundamental assumptions about human capabilities and intentions? I understand that perfectly, Vala replied. I also understand that without those humans, I would be dead. My entire crew would be dead, and the research data about harvester weaknesses would have been lost forever. Representative Yima from the core world spoke up. The humans have always been considered a minor species. They control only a handful of star systems and have limited military power. How could a cargo ship succeed where our military feared to go? Vala had thought about this question many times during her recovery. They succeeded because they didn't calculate the odds. They didn't form committees to study the risks. They saw people dying and decided that was unacceptable. While we were debating whether rescue was possible, they were already on their way. The implications of what she was saying rippled through the chamber. The Cathari Confederation prided itself on careful planning and logical decision-making. Their military strategies were based on detailed analysis and risk assessment. But in this case, all their caution had meant abandoning their own people to die. What do you recommend, Commander? Council Leader Aaron asked. I recommend we establish formal diplomatic relations with humanity immediately, Vala said without hesitation. I recommend we share our advanced technology with them in exchange for learning their tactical approaches, and I recommend we invite them to join our alliance against the harvesters. The chamber fell silent again. Formal alliance with humanity would be unprecedented. The human species had only achieved faster-than-light travel a few generations ago. They were considered newcomers to galactic civilization, interesting but not particularly important. The frequency weapon technology that disabled the Harvester Scout, Representative Colin asked. This came from your research? The theoretical framework came from ancient ruins that my team discovered, Vala explained. But the humans adapted it into a working weapon in a matter of hours, using nothing but spare parts and cargo ship systems. Their engineering approach is completely different from ours. Where we would spend months in careful testing, they build and modify on the fly. News of the rescue was spreading beyond Cathari space. The Corvan Empire, known for their military might, had requested detailed reports about human combat capabilities. The peaceful Talani Federation was asking questions about human diplomatic intentions. Even the reclusive Void Walkers had sent observers to learn more about this species that had dared to enter Harvester territory. Within days of Vala's testimony, the first human diplomatic mission arrived at the Cathari capital world. The delegation was small and simple, led by a middle-aged woman named Patricia Wells, who had previously been a trade negotiator. She seemed uncomfortable with all the attention, but determined to represent her species with dignity. We appreciate the gratitude you've shown, Patricia told the assembled council. But we want to be clear about our intentions. We didn't rescue your people to gain political advantage. We did it because it was the right thing to do. Council leader Aaron studied the human diplomat carefully. And now? What does humanity want from this relationship? Patricia smiled, and Vala was struck by how genuine it seemed. We want to learn from each other. Our species have different strengths. Together we might accomplish things that neither could do alone. The negotiations that followed moved faster than anyone had expected. Within weeks, the first joint human Cathari research stations were being planned. Human engineers would work alongside Cathari scientists to develop new applications for the frequency weapon technology. Cathari defensive systems would be adapted for human ships, while human tactical innovations would be integrated into Cathari military doctrine. But the most significant change was in how other species viewed humanity. The story of the Iron Dawn had captured imaginations across the galaxy. Here was a species that would risk everything to save strangers, that would fight impossible battles not for conquest, but for compassion. Vala found herself serving as an unofficial ambassador, traveling from world to world to speak about her experiences. Everywhere she went, the questions were the same. Were humans really as brave as the stories suggested? Would they truly come to the aid of any species that called for help? Yes, she would tell them every time. They will come. No matter how dangerous, no matter how impossible, they will come, because that's who they are. On a distant research station at the edge of human space, Captain Roy Mitchell received reports about the diplomatic meetings and alliance negotiations. The cargo captain, who had made a simple decision to answer a distress call, now found himself at the center of galactic politics. "Did you ever think it would lead to all this?" Dr. Amy Peterson asked him as they watched the news reports together. Roy shook his head. "I just wanted to help some people who were in trouble. I never expected it to change anything." But it had changed everything. The galaxy was talking about humanity in ways it never had before. Species that had barely acknowledged human existence were now seeking partnerships and alliances. The reputation that humans were building was not based on fear or military power, but on something much rarer and more valuable. They were building a reputation for keeping their promises and never abandoning their friends. The combined fleet stretched across space like a constellation of hope. 6 months after a simple cargo ship had answered a distress call, hundreds of vessels from dozens of species moved together toward the heart of Harvester territory. The largest armada in galactic history was not assembled for conquest or glory, but for survival, and the promise that no world would face the darkness alone. Commander Vala smiled and shook her head. "None at all, though I have to admit, I never expected that being rescued would lead to all this." Roy looked out at the assembled diplomats and military leaders from across the galaxy. "Neither did I. I just thought we were saving 4 people from a broken ship." "You were," Vala said quietly. "But you were also showing the galaxy what was possible when people choose compassion over fear, when they choose action over endless debate." As they watched, the last signatures were added to the treaty. The Alliance of Light was now official, bound together not by conquest or political necessity, but by the simple human principle that everyone deserved to be saved. "There's something I need to tell you," Vala said. "We've been monitoring long-range communications from the Outer Rim. There are reports of new Harvester attacks on 3 different systems. Civilian populations are requesting evacuation assistance." Roy nodded without surprise. "How many ships can we spare from the main fleet?" "That's just it," Vala replied. "The attacks are spread across such a wide area that we'll need to split our forces. Some of those rescue missions will be nearly as dangerous as what we just accomplished here. And?" Vala looked at him with something approaching wonder. "Every species in the Alliance has volunteered for the rescue missions. The Corvin Empire is sending their best battle cruisers to protect evacuation transports. The Talani Federation is preparing hospital ships for refugee treatment. Even the Void Walkers have offered to guide ships through dangerous space." Roy smiled, and Vala could see the same expression that had convinced his crew to risk everything for strangers. "Of course they did. They've learned what we knew all along." "What's that?" "That there's always someone worth saving. And there's always a way to help, even when the odds look impossible." 6 months later, Vala received a message that would have seemed impossible during those dark hours when she was dying aboard her broken ship. It was from the survivors of a Talani colony that had been evacuated just hours before a Harvester attack. The message simply said, "Thank you for teaching the galaxy that no one fights alone." Similar messages arrived daily from dozens of worlds. Species that had never heard of humans before the rescue of the Silent Current now sent their children to study at human academies. Military officers from across the galaxy trained alongside human tacticians to learn their unconventional approaches to impossible problems. The darkness between the stars was still there, vast and cold and full of dangers that could destroy entire civilizations. But now, it was also full of ships carrying the promise that help would always come. When distress signals went out into the void, they were answered not by silence, but by voices saying the words that had become humanity's gift to the galaxy. "We're on our way. Hold on. You're not alone." Standing on the bridge of her research vessel as it jumped to hyperspace toward another rescue mission, Vala remembered the moment when she had given up hope. She had believed that they would die forgotten in the darkness, that their lives would have no meaning beyond their own small circle of friends and family. She had been wrong. Their rescue had lit a spark that had become a flame, and that flame had become a beacon that now shone across the entire galaxy. The simple decision of one human captain to answer a distress call had changed the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. And somewhere out there in the vast darkness of space, another distress signal was being transmitted. Another desperate voice was calling for help. Another group of people was facing impossible odds and certain death. But they would not die alone. The Alliance would come for them just as the Iron Dawn had come for her. Because that was what the galaxy had learned from humanity, that compassion was not weakness, that courage was not foolishness, and that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe was simply refusing to let good people die when you had the power to save them. The darkness between stars would always be vast and cold, but it would never again be empty of hope. Thren stood on the bridge of her new research vessel, the Bright Current, watching the tactical displays that showed the massive fleet deployment. Cathari science ships worked alongside human destroyers, while Corvin battlecruisers provided escort for Talani hospital ships. Species that had never cooperated before were now united by a shared understanding of what humanity brought to the galaxy. "Admiral Peterson to all fleet commanders," came the voice over the communication system. Dr. Amy Peterson, the physician who had treated Vala's radiation poisoning, now wore the uniform of the combined fleet's medical commander. "Final. System checks complete. All vessels report ready for jump to target coordinates." Vala activated her ship's communication array. "This is Research Vessel Bright Current. Frequency weapon systems online and ready. We have lock-on to the primary harvester installation. The target was a massive biomechanical structure that the harvesters had built around a dying star. For decades, it had consumed the energy of entire solar systems, growing larger and more powerful with each world it devoured. Intelligence reports suggested it was some kind of breeding facility, producing new harvester ships to spread across the galaxy. But today, the monsters would learn what happened when they threatened worlds protected by human promises. "All ships! This is Fleet Admiral Roy Mitchell," came the familiar voice of the cargo captain who had started this unlikely alliance. 6 months ago, we answered a distress call because it was the right thing to do. Today, we're here to make sure no one else has to send that kind of message. All vessels, execute jump." The fleet disappeared into hyperspace in perfect coordination. Vala felt the familiar sensation of reality shifting around her as they traveled faster than light toward their destination. In minutes, they would either deliver a blow that could turn the tide of the war, or they would join the countless other species that had been consumed by harvester hunger. When they emerged from hyperspace, the sight before them was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The harvester installation was larger than a moon, its organic surface pulsing with biomechanical life. Thousands of smaller harvester ships swarmed around it like antibodies protecting a massive organism. The dying star at its center burned with unnatural colors as its energy was siphoned away to feed the alien structure. "My God," someone whispered over the open communication channel. "It's bigger than our intelligence report suggested." The Harvester response was immediate and overwhelming. Biomechanical ships larger than any they had encountered before emerged from the structure's surface. Weapons that could crack planets began charging with deadly energy. The installation itself began to orient toward the combined fleet, revealing weapon systems that dwarfed anything in their arsenal. But the fleet did not waver. Human tactical doctrine had taught them that impossible odds were just another kind of problem to solve. Cathari science had given them weapons that could strike at the heart of Harvester technology, and the Alliance itself had given them something that the Harvesters could never understand: the absolute certainty that no one would be abandoned. "All frequency weapon platforms commence bombardment," Admiral Peterson ordered. "All escort vessels protect the science ships at all costs." The battle that followed would be remembered across the galaxy for generations. Vala watched her instruments as dozens of modified frequency weapons struck the Harvester installation simultaneously. The biomechanical systems began to fail in cascading waves, but the structure was so massive that it would take time for the damage to spread throughout its entire bulk. Human destroyers darted between Harvester ships like deadly fish, their tactics unpredictable and aggressive. Corvin battlecruisers formed defensive walls to protect the more vulnerable vessels. Talani hospital ships moved through the battlefield, rescuing crew members from damaged vessels without regard for their species or origin. "This is Research Station Omega," came a desperate transmission from a remote scientific outpost. "We're under attack by Harvester forces. Request immediate assistance." Without hesitation, a squadron of human ships broke away from the main battle to answer the call. Vala watched them go and felt a surge of emotion that surprised her. This was what made humanity special. Even in the middle of the largest battle in galactic history, they would still risk everything to save strangers. The tide of battle began to turn as the frequency weapons continued their work. Harvester ships lost power and drifted helplessly as their biomechanical systems shut down. The massive installation began to crack and crumble as its internal structure failed. The dying star, freed from the alien machinery that had been draining it, blazed with renewed life. "All ships, this is Admiral Mitchell," came the announcement that Vala had been hoping to hear. "Primary target is neutralized. Begin search and rescue operations for any survivors in the system." The victory was complete, but Vala knew it was just the beginning. The Harvesters still controlled dozens of systems across the galaxy. There would be more battles, more rescues, more desperate calls for help from worlds facing extinction. But now they would not face that darkness alone. 3 days later, Vala stood in the observation deck of a human space station, watching as representatives from over 50 species signed the formal treaty that would become known as the Alliance of Light. The document established mutual defense agreements, shared technology programs, and most importantly, a solemn promise that no member world would ever be abandoned. Captain Roy Mitchell, now Fleet Admiral Mitchell, approached her as she watched the ceremony. His uniform was crisp and new, but his expression was the same as it had been on that day when he had made the decision to answer her distress call. "Any regrets, Commander?" he asked.